According to the Counting Dead Women website run by the domestic abuse campaigner Karen Ngala Smith, between the 23rd of March and the 12th of April of this year, there were 16 women and children killed in suspected domestic violence incidents. This compares to a 10-year average of 5 for the same period. Now, like with all coronavirus-related statistics, we probably won't be aware and won't know the true picture until after the crisis has passed. But an apparent threefold increase in domestic homicides is alarming and is, of course, only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all domestic violence incidents. Figures available from other sources, plus anecdotal evidence from criminal defence firms, all seem to support that there has been a significant increase in domestic violence during the lockdown. Refuge, the UK's largest domestic abuse charity, reported a 700% increase in calls to its helpline in a single day during the lockdown, whilst the Metropolitan Police have reported a 24% increase in domestic violence charges and cautions between the 9th of March and the 19th of April, compared to the same period last year. Now, in many ways, this is depressingly predictable. The pressures that lockdown has brought to many families, the financial stress, anxiety for many in terms of their future employment, and perhaps the greater use of alcohol as a coping mechanism, all contribute to things that could further exacerbate what may already be a very volatile situation. That, coupled with the confusion about the extent of the lockdown restrictions, perhaps being exploited by controlling partners and used to further isolate their victims, all further contributes to the increasing prevalence of domestic abuse under lockdown. And if the police and if some district judges get confused about the coronavirus laws, what hope does a victim of domestic abuse living with her abuser have in these circumstances to understand it? There's also been some anecdotal reports of an increase in stalking and harassment type offending. Again, it doesn't take too much imagination to see how someone's stuck at home without their usual distractions, maybe stuck at home on their own, and how they might start to ruminate and obsess to an extent that they begin to engage in that type of offending, perhaps against their current partners who they live apart from, or perhaps with ex-partners. So far, so inevitable. But what does this all mean in terms of prosecutions and the challenges in the current circumstances for both prosecutors and defendants? Well, the first is time limits, and I don't mean custody time limits as such, I mean the charging time limits. Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, in evidence given to the Home Affairs Select Committee last month, raised that there are going to be people experiencing domestic abuse at the moment, but are unable to call the police because it's simply not safe for them to do so, and may not be so until the lockdown is lifted. Now, we all know that the vast majority of domestic violence offending is summary only. It's common assault, harassment, and criminal damage, and therefore is subject to a 6-month charging limit. It was suggested in that Home Affairs Select Committee that the 6-month limit be relaxed in these circumstances so that these particularly vulnerable victims don't fall through the cracks. I mean, whether this will come to fruition remains to be seen, but it is and remains a possibility. Another way this could be tackled, specifically in relation to assault, is where there is some level of injury, but relatively minor, and so would ordinarily attract a charge of assault by beating, instead being charged as ABH. The CPS charging standard already allows for ABH to be charged where the injury is less serious, but there are other aggravating features present, one being the circumstances in which the assault took place. Now, it's arguable that a domestic assault taking place in the circumstances of a national lockdown and a national emergency is more serious, and particularly when the complainant is vulnerable. Another challenge in respect of a successful prosecution is continued victim engagement. Now, we all know that one of the main hindrances in successfully prosecuting domestic abuse is the complainant retracting. And the longer from incident to trial, the greater risk of retraction. This is why domestic abuse cases and domestic abuse trials are prioritised. Now, there are inevitably going to be delays under the current circumstances in getting cases to trial. And at this time, we have no idea when normal court service will resume. There is then a real danger that those delays will have a disproportionately negative impact on domestic violence conviction rates at a time when domestic violence offending is at an all-time high. In an attempt to counter this, we may well see a greater number of victimless prosecutions. Now, in terms of defendants and how these circumstances are affecting defendants in domestic violence cases, well, anecdotally again, an issue that has been arising is one of bail. Bail conditions preventing a defendant from contacting the complainant or living in the family home are commonplace in DV cases. Now, in ordinary circumstances, defendants may be able to stay with parents or family or perhaps friends. But this may very well not be possible under the current lockdown. Elderly parents may be in a vulnerable group, and friends who may already be finding restrictions difficult probably don't want an extra body on their sofa. And of course, hotels, bed and breakfasts, and Airbnb type accommodation is simply not available at the moment. So hopefully, as restrictions are eased, this may become less of a problem. Whether, though, in the meantime, this is translating into a greater use of remand is unknown, but it would certainly seem to run counter to my next point, which is sentencing. And of course, Maeve has already touched on this in her talk that she just gave. But at the moment, it seems that courts are very much being encouraged to avoid custodial sentences wherever possible. The case that Maeve referred to, the Crown against Manning, stated that the current conditions in prisons represent a factor which can properly be taken into account in deciding whether to suspend a sentence. And it went on to say that judges and magistrates can and should keep in mind that the impact of a custodial sentence is likely to be heavier during the current emergency than it would otherwise be. In addition to that guidance, the courts are also taking a much more flexible and generous approach to credit for guilty pleas at the moment. So to finish up, all the emerging evidence suggests that there has been an explosion of domestic violence under the current lockdown. However, with the usual obstacles to prosecuting domestic violence cases all greatly aggravated under lockdown, whether the greater numbers of incidents will eventually be reflected in a greater number of convictions remains to be seen. Thank you.